For most of human history, night was not peaceful. It was not quiet, not comforting. It was something else entirely. When the sun disappeared below the horizon, the world changed. Light faded quickly, temperatures dropped, and the familiar landscape became something unknown. There were no streetlights, no shelters with walls strong enough to block out the outside, only darkness. And in that darkness, humans were not at the top of the food chain. They were vulnerable. Predators moved differently at night, more freely, more confidently. Creatures with sharper hearing, better vision, stronger bodies. And early humans knew this. They could hear it. The distant call of animals, the movement in the brush, the quiet signals that something was out there, watching. Night was not just the absence of light. It was a different world. And surviving it required something new. Not speed, not strength, but awareness. And over time, understanding. Why night was so dangerous. When the sun disappeared, humans lost one of their greatest advantages: vision. Early humans were adapted for daylight. Their eyes, like ours, work best in bright conditions. Color, detail, depth, all of it depends on light. At night, that ability fades. Humans do have limited night vision, but compared to many predators, it is weak. Animals like big cats, wolves, and hyenas evolved to hunt in low light. Their eyes contain a higher concentration of rod cells, specialized for detecting movement in darkness. Some also have a reflective layer behind the retina, called the tapetum lucidum, which enhances their ability to see at night. Humans do not have this. In darkness, our vision becomes blurry. Details disappear. Movement becomes harder to track. And that created a dangerous imbalance. Because while humans struggled to see, other animals could see them. Night shifted the balance of power. During the day, humans could rely on coordination, endurance, and awareness. They could track animals, move in groups, react to threats. But at night, those advantages were reduced. Predators became more active. Many large carnivores are nocturnal or crepuscular, meaning they hunt during the night or at dawn and dusk. This includes animals that early humans would have encountered: saber-toothed cats, hyenas, large wolves, other big predators depending on the region. These animals relied on stealth. They didn't chase over long distances. They waited, watched, moved quietly, and in the dark. That strategy was far more effective. Humans, by contrast, were easier to detect. The sound of movement, the smell, even the shape of a body against the horizon. Without strong night vision, every sound carried more weight. A branch snapping, wind moving through grass, distant footsteps. It was difficult to tell the difference between something harmless and something dangerous. This uncertainty created constant tension. And that tension shaped behavior. Early humans likely stayed closer together at night. Groups provided safety. More eyes, more ears. If one person noticed something, others could react. Sleeping alone would have been extremely risky. Instead, groups would rest together, often in places that offered some natural protection: caves, rock overhangs, elevated ground. Not because these places were perfect, but because they reduced exposure. Even then, safety was never guaranteed. Night was unpredictable, and survival depended on minimizing risk. Staying still, staying alert, staying together. Over time, humans didn't just endure the night. They began to understand it, not as something to control, but as something to navigate, learning its patterns, its sounds, its rhythms. Because the night, like the land, had its own rules, and those who learned those rules had a better chance of surviving until morning. the feeling of darkness. Long before language could fully explain it, humans felt the night. Not just as darkness, but as something deeper. A shift in awareness. When visibility drops, the brain begins to change how it processes the world. Less reliance on sight, more focus on sound, on movement, on subtle changes in the environment. This is not unique to early humans. It still happens now. In low light, the brain becomes more sensitive to uncertainty. When something cannot be clearly seen, the mind begins to fill in the gaps. Shapes appear where there are none. Movement is imagined. Silence becomes suspicious. This is part of a natural survival response. The brain is designed to prioritize caution over accuracy. It is safer to assume that something might be a threat than to ignore it completely. This tendency is sometimes referred to as a kind of hyperactive threat detection. In simple terms, the brain would rather be wrong and safe than right and vulnerable. For early humans, this response was essential. In a world without artificial light, darkness meant limited information, and limited information means increased risk. So the brain adapted. Heart rate might increase slightly. Muscles stay ready. Attention sharpens. Even small sounds, like wind moving through grass, or the shifting of leaves, could trigger alertness. Not panic, but readiness. This constant awareness shaped how humans experienced the night. It wasn't just physically darker. It felt different. Time itself seemed to slow. Without visual reference points, moments stretched. Silence deepened. The world became less defined. And in that space, the imagination became more active. This is where many early fears likely began. Not as stories. Not yet. But as sensations. The sense that something could be there, even when nothing was visible. Over generations, these responses became deeply ingrained. Even today, they learn to work with it, to exist within it, to remain still, even when uncertainty was high, because reacting too quickly could be just as dangerous as not reacting at all. So balance became important. Awareness, without panic. Stillness, without vulnerability. Listening, without overreacting. This balance was not taught in words. It was learned through experience, night after night. And slowly, what was once overwhelming became familiar, not safe, but understood. A different kind of environment, with its own rules, its own rhythm, and those who adapted to that rhythm could rest, even in the dark. Choosing where to rest. For early humans, surviving the night didn't begin when the sun went down. It began long before that. Where you chose to stop could determine whether you would see the morning. This decision wasn't random. It was based on observation, memory, experience. Over time, humans began to recognize which environments offered even the smallest advantage. Elevated ground, for example, was often preferred, not because it was comfortable, but because it allowed visibility. From a slightly higher position, it was easier to detect movement below. Sound carried differently. Air moved more freely. Predators approaching from a distance were slightly easier to notice. Even a small increase in awareness could make a difference. Another common choice was natural shelter. Caves, rock overhangs, dense tree cover. These environments provided partial protection. A cave entrance, for example, limited the directions from which danger could approach. Instead of being exposed on all sides, humans could focus their attention forward. But caves were not always safe. Many predators used them as well. Large cats, bears, and other animals often occupied the same spaces humans sought for shelter. So entering a cave required caution. Signs were observed. Tracks. Smell. Remains of previous activity. If the space was already claimed, it was avoided. If it was empty, it might be used. Even then, risk remained. Open environments had their own trade-offs. A wide, flat area allowed for better visibility, but offered no protection. A dense forest provided cover, but limited sight. Each choice came with advantages and disadvantages, and early humans learned to weigh them. Water sources were another factor. Staying near water meant access to drinking resources, but it also meant increased animal activity. Many animals gather at water, especially at night. This made such areas both useful and dangerous, so distance mattered. Close enough to reach water if needed, but far enough to avoid constant exposure. Wind direction was likely considered as well. Predators rely heavily on scent. Positioning downwind, so that human scent traveled away from likely threat areas, could reduce the chance of detection. These decisions weren't calculated in words. They were felt, learned through repetition. A group that chose well was more likely to survive. A group that didn't might not get another chance. Over time, these patterns became instinctive. Certain types of places began to feel right. Others felt wrong, even without clear explanation. And as groups returned to the same locations over time, these places became familiar, known, a kind of early map. Stored not on paper, but in memory, where it was safer to rest, where it was better to avoid. And when night approached, that knowledge guided them. Because once darkness settled in, there was little room for error. So the decision had to be made before the light was gone. How humans slept in a dangerous world. Sleep, for early humans, was never complete. It couldn't be. In a world where danger could appear without warning, becoming fully unaware, even for a few hours, was a risk. So human sleep likely adapted, not to eliminate rest, but to balance it with awareness. Even today, human sleep is not one solid, uninterrupted state. It moves in cycles: light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep, where dreaming occurs. Each cycle lasts roughly 90 minutes. But in unfamiliar or unsafe environments, the brain behaves differently. It stays partially alert. There is a phenomenon observed even in modern humans, sometimes called the first night effect. When people sleep in a new place, part of the brain remains more active, less deeply asleep, more responsive to sound, almost as if one side is keeping watch. This isn't a flaw. It's a feature, a leftover adaptation. For early humans, this likely happened often, not just on the first night, but every night, especially in exposed environments. Sleep may have been lighter, more fragmented. Short periods of rest, interrupted by moments of awareness. Waking briefly, listening, then resting again. This kind of sleep is sometimes described as segmented sleep. Instead of one long stretch, rest happens in intervals. And in a group setting, this becomes even more effective. Not everyone would be in the same stage of sleep at the same time. Some would be in deeper rest, others closer to waking, meaning someone was almost always partially alert. This created a natural system of shared awareness. Not planned, not assigned, but emerging naturally from how human sleep works. The presence of others also mattered. Being close to a group reduces stress. Even today, studies show that people sleep more deeply when they feel safe. For early humans, safety came from proximity. Hearing others breathing, sensing movement nearby. These subtle cues signaled that the group was still intact. still together, and that reduced the need for constant, full alertness. The environment influenced sleep as well. Temperature drops at night naturally signal the body to rest. The absence of light triggers the release of melatonin, a hormone that helps regulate sleep. Without artificial light, this process would have been more aligned with the natural day-night cycle. Sleep began shortly after darkness, and ended with the first light of dawn. But unlike modern sleep, it was not uninterrupted. It was responsive, flexible, always ready to shift if needed. A sound, a movement, a change in the environment, and the body would wake. Not fully, but enough. Enough to assess. Enough to react. Then, if everything was safe, rest would return. Slowly. This kind of sleep wasn't perfect. But it worked. Because it allowed humans to recover. Without becoming completely vulnerable. A balance between rest and readiness. And over time, that balance became part of what it meant to survive the night. Fire and the first light in the dark. At some point, long before written history, humans began to do something no other animal had ever truly mastered. They controlled fire. Not just witnessing it, not just fearing it, but keeping it, using it. And in doing so, they changed the night forever. The earliest evidence of controlled fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years. Sites associated with early humans, like Wonderwork Cave, show signs of burned materials deep inside cave systems, suggesting that fire was not just encountered, but maintained. This mattered, because natural fire, caused by lightning or wildfires, was unpredictable, temporary. To control fire meant something different. It meant carrying it, preserving it, feeding it. Fire had to be protected. If it went out, it could be difficult to replace. So early humans likely treated it as something valuable, something worth watching. And in return, fire gave them advantages no other species had. The most immediate was light. A small flame could push back the darkness. Not completely, but enough. The area around a fire became visible, defined. Shadows moved at the edges. But within the glow, there was clarity. This alone changed behavior. Humans could now remain active after sunset, not wandering far, but existing within a space of light. A boundary between safety and the unknown. Fire also changed how predators behaved. Most animals are cautious around fire. The movement of flames, the heat, the unfamiliar smell. All of it created distance. A fire did not make humans invulnerable, but it reduced risk. It created a kind of perimeter, a zone where approaching too closely became less likely. And for the first time, humans could rest with something like protection. Then there was warmth. As temperatures dropped at night, especially during colder periods, fire provided stability. The body no longer had to rely only on its own heat. This reduced energy loss, conserved strength, and made survival in colder regions far more possible. But one of the most important changes was not physical. It was social. Fire created a center, a place where people gathered, not just for warmth, but for connection. Faces became visible, expressions clearer. Communication, whatever form it took at the time, became easier. Gestures could be seen, movements understood. And in these spaces, something new began to develop. Shared time. Moments not spent moving, not spent hunting, not spent reacting to immediate danger, but simply being. This may have been where early storytelling began. Not as structured narratives, but as memory. repetition, a gesture reenacted, a sound imitated, an experience shared, and through this, knowledge was passed on. Fire also affected sleep. With light and warmth, the body could relax more deeply. The edge of constant alertness softened. Not completely, but enough to allow more stable rest. And over time, the presence of fire became normal. Expected. The night was no longer entirely dark. It was divided. Light and shadow, safety and uncertainty. And humans learned to live between those two spaces, tending the flame, watching its movement, listening to the sounds beyond it. Because even with fire, the night was still the night. But now, it was something that could be endured, with a little more control. How fire changed humans themselves. Fire didn't just change the night. It began to change humans. Slowly, across thousands of generations. In ways that were not immediately visible. One of the most important changes came through food. Before fire, most food had to be eaten raw. Raw plants could be tough, hard to digest, sometimes even toxic. Raw meat required more effort to chew, more energy to break down. But when food is exposed to heat, something happens. Proteins begin to break apart. Starches soften. Toxins in some plants are reduced. In simple terms, food becomes easier for the body to use. More energy can be extracted with less effort. This had a long-term effect, because the human body runs on energy, and the brain, in particular, requires a lot of it. Even today, the human brain uses a significant portion of the body's energy supply, far more than most other organs. Access to more efficient food made that possible over long periods of time. This is believed to have supported the growth of larger, more complex brains. Not instantly, but gradually, generation by generation. Fire also changed how time was experienced. Before fire, activity was closely tied to daylight. When the sun set, most activity slowed. But with fire, the day extended. Not indefinitely, but enough to create something new. Extra hours. Time that was not strictly required for survival. And in those hours, different behaviors began to emerge. More interaction, more communication, more observation. Sitting together around a fire, humans had time to notice things. Patterns, sounds, each other. This may have played a role in the development of more complex social structures. Because relationships require time. Understanding others requires attention. And fire created the conditions for that attention to exist. There is also evidence that fire influenced physical changes in the human body. With cooked food being easier to chew, jaw sizes gradually reduced. Teeth became smaller compared to earlier human ancestors. The digestive system also adapted. If food is already partially broken down through cooking, the body does not need to work as hard to process it over long periods. This can lead to changes in how energy is distributed within the body. Less energy spent on digestion, more available for other functions, including the brain. Fire also affected sleep patterns. With light available after sunset, humans were no longer completely bound to the natural cycle of darkness. Sleep could be delayed slightly, shifted. Not dramatically at first, but enough to introduce flexibility. The night became something that could be experienced, not just endured. And with that, the human relationship with darkness began to change. It was no longer only a time of danger. It became a time of gathering, of rest, of shared presence. Still uncertain, still unpredictable, but no longer completely overwhelming. And through all of this, Fire remained at the center. A constant. Something to return to maintain, to protect. Because as long as the fire remained, the night could be managed, not controlled, but understood. Just a little more. Different nights, different worlds. Night was never the same everywhere. Even though darkness came to all places, what it felt like, what it meant, depended entirely on where you were. In open grasslands, night was wide. The horizon stretched far in every direction. There were few barriers, few places to hide. This meant visibility, what little there was, could extend outward. Movement could sometimes be detected at a distance. A shape crossing the land, a shift in the grass. But it also meant exposure. There was nowhere to retreat, no natural walls, only open space. The wind moved freely, carrying sound, carrying scent. Predators could approach from almost any direction. So in these environments, awareness had to be constant. Groups likely positioned themselves carefully, staying close together, keeping the fire visible. The open land offered warning, but little protection. In forests, the night was different, denser, closer. Trees blocked the sky. Limited visibility even further. Sound behaved differently. It echoed, shifted, bounced between trunks and branches. This made it harder to determine direction. A sound could feel close when it was far, or far when it was near. Movement was also harder to detect. Shadows layered over shadows, and within that complexity, anything could be hidden. But forests also provided cover, places to shelter, to remain unseen. The same environment that concealed danger could also conceal humans. So survival depended on familiarity, knowing the terrain, recognizing patterns, understanding how sound moved through that space. In colder regions, night brought another challenge: temperature. As the sun disappeared, heat dropped quickly. In Ice Age environments, this drop could be severe. Without protection, without fire, survival through the night became extremely difficult. Cold slows the body, reduces mobility, impacts decision-making. So in these regions, maintaining warmth was critical. Fire was not just helpful, it was necessary. Shelter became more important. Wind exposure had to be minimized. Clothing, made from animal hides and fur, played a major role. Layers trapped heat, reduced loss, and the group itself provided warmth. Sitting close together, sharing body heat. In deserts, night offered relief. The intense heat of the day faded. Temperatures dropped, sometimes rapidly. But this created a different kind of challenge. Extreme temperature swings. Hot during the day, cold at night. The body had to adjust quickly, and visibility in desert environments could still be limited. Not by trees, but by darkness across wide, open land. However, the sky in these regions was often clear. Stars were highly visible, and over time, these became important, not just for navigation, but for understanding the passing of time. In coastal regions, night followed the rhythm of the water. Tides shifted. Waves moved in patterns. Sound was constant. The ocean never fully quiet. This created a different kind of background awareness. Not silence, but continuous motion. And within that, changes could be noticed. A disruption in the rhythm. A sound that didn't belong. Each environment shaped the night differently, and humans adapted to each one, not by changing the night itself, but by learning how to exist within it, recognizing its patterns, its dangers, its subtle signals. Because no matter where they were, the night remained something to be respected, not feared completely, but never ignored. And over time, across all these different worlds, humans became something unique, a species that could survive, not just in one environment, but in many, day or night, light or darkness, always adapting. What the night did to the mind. As the body adapted to the night, so did the mind. Because darkness doesn't just change what we see, it changes how we think. Without clear visual information, the brain begins to rely more on imagination. Shapes become uncertain, boundaries soften. A distant object might appear closer than it is. A shadow might seem like movement. This isn't a mistake. It's the brain trying to interpret incomplete information. In daylight, the world is defined. Edges are clear. Objects are stable. But at night, those definitions fade. And in their place, the mind fills the gaps. For early humans, this would have been a constant experience. The space just beyond the firelight. Never fully visible. Always shifting. And because the brain is wired to detect patterns, it begins to create them. A cluster of shadows becomes a shape. A sound becomes a presence. Not always real, but not always harmless to ignore either. So the mind remained active, alert, even in stillness. Over time, this heightened sensitivity may have influenced how humans began to understand the world. Not just physically, but conceptually. The night introduced uncertainty. And with uncertainty came questions. What is out there? Beyond what can be seen? What moves in the dark? What exists when there is no light to reveal it? These weren't asked in words at first, but they were felt. And feeling often comes before explanation. Sitting around a fire, watching shadows move along cave walls or across the ground, early humans were exposed to something new. Abstract shapes, changing forms, patterns that didn't always match reality. And in those moments, the mind had space to imagine, to connect ideas, to create meaning where none was obvious. This may have been one of the earliest foundations of symbolic thinking, the ability to see something and understand it as something else. A shadow as an animal. A sound as a signal. Over long periods of time, this ability becomes more refined. And eventually, it becomes language, story, belief. But at this stage, it was simpler. A shared experience. A gesture toward the darkness. A reaction to a sound. A recognition of something unseen. The night gave the mind room to expand. Because during the day, attention is focused on survival, movement, hunting, gathering. But at night, especially around fire, there is stillness. And in that stillness, the mind wanders, not aimlessly, but creatively, connecting experiences, replaying moments, anticipating possibilities. Even dreaming becomes more significant. Dreams, vivid, sometimes emotional, may have felt deeply real. Without a clear understanding of what a dream was, the boundary between reality and imagination could blur. And that, too, shaped how humans understood existence. The night was not just something to survive. It was something that changed perception, expanded awareness. And slowly, very slowly, it began to shape the way humans thought about the world. Not just as a physical place, but as something deeper. Something that extended beyond what could be seen. When the night became familiar, at first, night was something to endure. A period of uncertainty, of reduced control. But over time, something changed. Not in the night itself, but in how humans experienced it. Through repetition, the unfamiliar became familiar. The same sounds returned. Night after night. Wind moving through grass. Insects creating a steady rhythm. Distant animal calls that followed patterns. Even if those patterns were subtle. At first, these sounds might have felt unpredictable. But over time, they became recognizable. And recognition reduces fear. When the brain can identify a sound, it no longer treats it as completely unknown. It becomes part of the environment. Expected. This is how the night slowly shifted. From something overwhelming to something understood. Not safe, but known. Fire played a role in this transformation. With a stable source of light, the immediate surroundings became consistent. The same circle of visibility. The same flickering shadows. Night after night. The experience repeated. And repetition creates stability. The body begins to relax more quickly. The mind becomes less reactive. Not because danger disappears, but because it becomes easier to recognize. Over time, routines formed. The group would settle as the light faded. Fire would be prepared, maintained. Positions would be chosen, often in ways that had worked before. These patterns reduced decision-making. Less uncertainty. Less need to constantly evaluate new risks. Even the act of resting became more predictable. Where to sit. Where to lie down. Who stayed closest to the fire. All of it shaped by previous nights. And with that, the body began to trust the process. Melatonin levels would rise naturally as darkness settled in. The body signaling that it was time to rest. Heart rate slowing. Muscles releasing tension. The same biological rhythms that exist today were already in place, aligned with the cycle of light and dark. And as the night became more familiar, something else happened. It became quieter. Not in sound, but in feeling. Less urgency. Less tension. Moments of stillness became longer. Sitting by the fire. Watching the same flames move. Listening to the same patterns in the distance. The mind no longer needed to interpret every sound as a threat. Some could simply be allowed. And in that space, rest became deeper. Not perfect, but enough. Enough to recover. Enough to continue. The night didn't change. But humans did. They learned its rhythm, its signals, its boundaries. And in doing so, they found a way not just to survive it, but to exist within it, calmly. The quiet patterns of night. As the night became more familiar, it also became more structured. Not through rules, not through planning, but through repetition. The same small actions, repeated night after night, began to form patterns, and those patterns became something close to routine. As the sun lowered, movement would slow, not suddenly, but gradually. Tasks would begin to wind down. Travel would stop. The search for food would pause, and attention would shift toward preparation. Fire would be built, or strengthened, fuel gathered, position adjusted, not hurried, but intentional, because once darkness settled fully, there would be less room to adapt. So everything important happened just before. This transition, from day to night, became one of the most important moments of the cycle. A shift in behavior. From outward movement to inward focus. From action to stillness. Once the fire was steady, the group would gather. Not always in the same positions, but in familiar arrangements. Close enough to share warmth. Close enough to sense one another. These positions likely carried meaning. Not in words, but in feeling. Where you sat, who you were near. Over time, these arrangements would become consistent, a kind of unspoken structure. Children closer to the center, more experienced individuals positioned where awareness was strongest, not assigned, but naturally forming. As night deepened, movement decreased even further. Voices, if used, would soften, energy would lower, the body responding to darkness in predictable ways. The fire became the center of everything. Light, warmth, focus. Beyond it, the world faded. And within it, the group existed. Time, during these moments, was different, without clear visual markers, without tasks to measure it. It stretched. Minutes felt longer. Stillness became more noticeable. The mind slowed. Not completely, but enough to shift into a different state. This is where rest began. Not at the moment of sleep, but in the gradual release of activity. A soft transition. From awareness to calm. From movement to stillness. And within that stillness, the same patterns repeated. Night after night. Firelight flickering. Breathing steady. Distant sounds continuing in the background. A rhythm formed. Not controlled, but reliable. And over time, that rhythm became something the body expected, recognized, even without thinking. The night was no longer something entirely unknown. It had shape. It had flow. And humans moved within it, quietly. The first true moments of rest. At some point during the night, without a clear beginning, rest would take over. Not all at once, not like a switch being turned off, but gradually. The body, having slowed, having settled into the rhythm of darkness, would begin to let go, muscles relaxing, breathing deepening, awareness softening, but never fully disappearing. Because even in rest, some part of the mind remained present, listening, not actively searching for danger, but ready to respond if needed. This is how humans learn to rest in uncertainty. Not by removing it, but by existing within it. The fire played a quiet role here. Its light steady, its warmth consistent. A constant signal that the immediate space was stable, that nothing had changed. The crackle of burning wood, the soft shifting of embers. These sounds became familiar, predictable, and predictability allows the mind to relax. Even subtle patterns, like the rhythm of breathing from others nearby, contributed to this. A shared environment, a shared stillness. Over time, the body begins to trust these signals. Heart rate lowers, stress reduces, sleep deepens. Not completely, but enough. Enough to restore energy, enough to prepare for the next day. And within that rest, dreams likely emerged. Not understood as dreams, not separated from reality in the way we understand now, but experienced fully. Images, sounds, fragments of memory, replayed, recombined, sometimes calm, sometimes intense. The brain processing the day, organizing experience. Even in sleep, the mind remained active, working quietly. And when brief awakenings occurred, which they often did, the transition back to awareness was smooth. Eyes opening slightly, listening, then closing again. If nothing had changed. This rhythm, rest, awareness, rest again, repeated throughout the night, creating a balance. Not perfect sleep, but effective sleep. The kind of rest that allowed survival. In a world that never fully stopped. And eventually, as the darkest hours passed, something subtle began to shift. Not in sound, not in temperature, but in light. Almost unnoticeable at first. The sky beginning to change. And with that change, the night slowly came to an end. The long hours before dawn. There is a part of the night that feels different from all the rest. Not the beginning, when darkness first settles, and not the end, when light begins to return, but the middle, the longest stretch. The hours when time feels suspended. For early humans, this was often the quietest period. The fire had settled into a steady burn, no longer newly built, no longer being adjusted, just glowing, embers shifting slowly, flames rising and falling in soft patterns. Light dimmer than before, but still present. This stage of the fire mattered. A strong fire at the beginning of the night creates security, but a sustained fire creates consistency. It becomes something the body can rely on. And during these deeper hours, the group would be mostly at rest, breathing slow, movement minimal, but not completely still. Occasional shifts, a repositioning, a brief waking. These small movements are important. Even today, the human body adjusts position many times during sleep. This prevents stiffness, maintains circulation. For early humans, these movements also served another purpose. They reconnected awareness. A brief return to the environment. A quick check, even without fully waking. Then back to rest. The night during these hours was not silent. It only seemed that way. In reality, it was full of subtle sound. Insects moving in patterns. Wind shifting direction. Distant animal calls that repeated over time. But once these sounds became familiar, they faded into the background. The brain no longer treated them as threats. This is known even today. When a sound is consistent, the brain filters it out, like the hum of a fan, or distant traffic. For early humans, the night had its own version of this, a constant, low-level rhythm. And within that rhythm, the body could finally settle more deeply. This is likely when the deepest sleep occurred, not at the beginning of the night, when alertness was still high, but here, in the middle, when the environment felt most stable, when the fire was steady, when the group was still. This allowed the body to enter deeper sleep stages, where physical recovery is strongest, where muscles repair, energy is restored, and the brain begins organizing memory, even without understanding it. Early humans depended on this phase, because without deep rest, the next day becomes harder. Slower reaction time, reduced awareness, and in their world, that mattered. So the body adapted to find this deeper rest. Even within uncertainty, the air during these hours would often feel colder. Temperatures typically reach their lowest point just before dawn. Without fire, this would be dangerous. But with it, the difference could be managed. The warmth of the group also mattered. Bodies close together retain heat more effectively. This is simple thermoregulation. Heat loss is reduced. Energy is conserved. And energy was everything. The sky above, during these hours, was often at its clearest, with no sunlight, and minimal atmospheric interference. Stars would appear sharper, more defined. The band of the Milky Way stretching across the sky. A constant presence, night after night. Though early humans did not map the stars as we do now, they would have noticed patterns, repetition, certain arrangements appearing at the same times of year, slow shifts over longer periods. This added another layer to the night. Not just darkness, but structure, a sky that moved, predictably, even if its meaning wasn't fully understood. And as the night continued, the body remained in this rhythm: rest, awareness, rest again, until, gradually, something began to change, so subtle that it could easily be missed. A slight lightening of the horizon, not enough to see clearly, but enough to signal what was coming, and with that signal, the body began to shift once more, slowly preparing to return to the world of light.
The first light of morning, long before the sun appears. The world begins to change, not suddenly, not in a way that demands attention, but gradually, so slowly that it can almost go unnoticed. At the edge of the horizon, darkness begins to soften, not replaced, just less complete. The sky shifts from deep black to something lighter, a faint gradient, barely visible at first. For early humans, this moment mattered, because it signaled something important. The night was ending, and with that, the balance of the world was shifting again. Predators that moved confidently in darkness would begin to retreat. Animals that avoided the night would begin to emerge. The environment itself was changing states. Even before full light returned, the body responds to this. There is a natural sensitivity to early morning light. Even very low levels of light, before sunrise, can begin to influence the brain. Melatonin production starts to decrease. The hormone that encouraged sleep begins to fade. At the same time, cortisol levels begin to rise slightly, preparing the body for wakefulness. This process is automatic. It does not require awareness. It happens because it always has. For early humans, there were no alarms, no clocks, only this gradual shift. Light returning, in its own time. The first individuals to wake would likely not do so abruptly. Eyes opening slowly, breathing still steady, awareness returning in layers. The fire, if still burning, would be one of the first things noticed. Its glow weaker now, less dominant in the presence of growing light. The sounds of the environment would change as well. The steady rhythm of the night beginning to fade, replaced by new sounds, birds, movement, the early activity of daytime life. These transitions were consistent, repeated every morning, and over time, the body learned them, expected them. Even before fully waking, there is recognition, a sense that something has shifted. The group would begin to stir. Small movements at first. Someone sitting up, another adjusting position. The quiet stillness of the night, gradually giving way to motion, not rushed, never sudden, because energy had to be conserved. Every movement still mattered. The fire might be adjusted, fed again, or allowed to fade, depending on the needs of the day. And as the light increased, the world became visible once more. Shapes returned, details sharpened, the unknown spaces of the night revealed again. What had been hidden was now clear. And with that clarity came a different kind of awareness, less inward, more outward, attention shifting back to the environment, to movement, to action, to survival in daylight. But for a brief moment, between night and day, there was something else, a pause, a stillness, that belonged to either. And in that moment, the world felt balanced. Not dark, not bright, just quiet. And then, slowly, the sun rose.
The quiet between light and dark. And so, the night passes. Not all at once. Not with a clear ending. But gradually. Darkness softens. Light returns. And the world begins again. For early humans, this cycle repeated. Every single day. Light. Movement. Survival. Then darkness. Stillness. Rest. Again and again. For thousands of years. The night was never fully conquered. It was never made completely safe. But it was understood. Learned. Lived with. Through fire. Through awareness. Through quiet adaptation. Humans found a way. Not to control the darkness. But to exist within it. To rest. Even when the world around them remained uncertain. And over time, that uncertainty became something softer, less overwhelming, more familiar. The sounds of the night, once sharp and unpredictable, became part of a rhythm. The movement in the distance, no longer always a threat, but something to notice, then release. The fire, once a fragile necessity, became a constant. A small, steady light. In a world that was mostly dark, and within that light, humans gathered, rested, breathed. Shared something quiet. That did not need words. Because long before language, long before cities, long before the world became what it is now, there were nights like this. Simple, uncertain, but lived through, again and again. And even now, though the world has changed, though the night is filled with artificial light, and the darkness no longer feels the same, something remains, a quiet part of the mind, that still listens, when everything else becomes still. A part that recognizes the dark, not as something new, but as something remembered. Because deep within us, beyond the noise of the modern world, we are still connected to those early nights, to the firelight, to the slow rhythm of breathing in the dark, to the awareness that fades and returns and fades again. And if everything is quiet enough, if the world slows just enough, you can still feel it. Not fear, not urgency, but something softer, a kind of calm that exists only when nothing is required. No movement, no decision, just rest. And in that rest, the night becomes what it always could have been. Not something to survive, but something to drift through, slowly, quietly, until morning comes again. Sleep well.